Hope left the sailors' eyes as they watched their comrades on ships much faster than theirs, the distance between their allies increasing, and the distance between them and their enemies closing rapidly. The sailors aboard the man-of-war prepared for capture, and the British closed in. Welcome to Shipwreck Sunday. My name is Eleanor. Just a quick disclaimer for a younger audience before we dive in. This story may be disturbing to some, so viewer discretion is advised. Okay everyone, let's get into it. USS Alfred wasn't always a colonial warship, starting as a merchant ship called the Black Prince. The Black Prince was built in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1774, and unfortunately, there seems to be no surviving record of who built her, but it's possible it might have been John Wharton. Take that with a grain of salt. She was owned by Willing Morris & Company, a merchant trading firm operated out of Philadelphia. She was launched in the fall of 1774, and during this time, tensions were tight between the colonies and Great Britain. She was quickly fitted out so she could load up and sail to Bristol on the last day of 1774, and she didn't return until April 25, 1775, just 6 days after the Battle of Lexington, which was the beginning of the American Revolution. Before we get too far off course, let's look at her specs. So, Black Prince was a classic little lady, so her tonnage is in tons burthen, which is the builder's old measurement used in England from approximately 1650 to 1849 for calculating the cargo capacity of a ship. She was approximately 440 tons burthen, and was 140 feet long, had a beam of 32 feet wide, and a draft of 15 feet deep. As a warship, her complement consisted of 220 officers and men. As for armament, she had 20 9-pounder guns and 10 6-pounder guns. She had 2 masts and would be commissioned as a frigate during her wartime service. She was teetering on wartime service. And we're ready to dive into her story. If you're enjoying this video, leave me a like, subscribe to the channel for more content, and let me know down in the comments section below. Okay, let's look at her service history. Her owners, wanting to cash in as much as they could, were fearful that American commerce would soon be halted, and so they again raced to load and provision her. Black Prince set out for London on May 7th, though she didn't reach it until June 27th. The ship left the Thames River on August 10th. However, she encountered contrary winds during much of her westward voyage, and finally returned to Philly on October 4th. While the ship had been abroad, a lot of moments happened during the Revolution. The Battle of Bunker Hill had been fought, the other colonies acting in Congress had pledged to support Massachusetts in its struggle for freedom, and George Washington had taken command of the American Army besieging British-occupied Boston. Speaking of Boston, there was a bit of tea to be had as she crossed the Atlantic again. Private correspondence between one of the ship's operators, Robert Morris, and his trading partner Richard Champion of Bristol was brought from England on Black Prince to members of the Continental Congress. In this correspondence, it was reported that the British government was sending to America 2 unarmed brigs heavily laden with gunpowder and arms. Though it was nearly 2 centuries before the CIA would be created, intelligence like this was still a key factor in winning this war. This information prompted Congress on October 13th to authorize the fitting out of 2 American warships, one of 10 guns and the other of an unspecified size, to attempt to capture these ships and divert their invaluable cargoes to the ill-equipped soldiers of Washington's army. Congress decided on October 30th to specify the second vessel as being 14 guns to add 2 more ships to the Navy, one of 20 guns and the other slightly larger but not to exceed 36 guns. One of the ship's owners, Morris, was a member of the Marine Committee when that committee acquired the Black Prince, now named Alfred after Alfred the Great of Wessex, as she was sold on November 4, 1775. A second ship, also owned by Willing Morris & Company, became the Columbus at this time. 4 days later, a fitting out as a man-of-war was ordered by the Continental Congress. Soon, 4 other ships joined her in the Continental Navy: Columbus, Cabot, Andrew Doria, and the sloop Providence. She was acquired on December 3, 1775, and Essex Hopkins, the commodore of the flotilla, chose her as his flagship. On the same day, she became the first ship to ever fly the flag of America, the precursor to the U.S. flag. The ensign was hoisted on the Delaware by Lieutenant John Paul Jones and documented in letters to Congress. The new fleet dropped down the Delaware on January 4th, 1776. However, a nasty cold snap froze the river and the bay, checking its progress at Reedy Island for about 6 weeks. When the thaw came, Hopkins' flotilla was released around mid-February, and the fleet sortied on February 18th for its first operation. The Marine Committee had ordered Hopkins to head for Hampton Roads to attack British warships, which were harassing American shipping in Virginia waters, then to continue on to Charleston, South Carolina to do the same thing, and finally onto Rhode Island to complete her round. Hopkins was given discretion of disregarding these orders if they proved impossible and planning on operation of his own. However, by the time his ships were free from the ice, growing British strength in the Chesapeake prompted Hopkins to head for the West Indies. The American colonies desperately needed gunpowder, so Hopkins decided to attack the island of New Providence in the Bahamas to capture a large supply of that commodity, as well as other military supplies reportedly stored there in great quantity. 2 weeks after leaving the Delaware on March 3rd, Hopkins arrived off Nassau and captured Fort Montague in a bloodless Battle of Nassau, in which Continental Marines joined Hopkins' sailors in America's first amphibious operation. Later, Hopkins issued a proclamation which promised not to harm, quote, the persons or property of the inhabitants of New Providence if they did not resist. Eventually, Governor Montfort Brown would surrender Fort Nassau, but he was clever and whisked away most of the island's precious gunpowder to St. Augustine, Florida. After Hopkins stripped the forts of their guns and all remaining ordnance, Alfred led the American fleet homeward from Nassau Harbor on St. Patrick's Day, March 17, 1776, the same day that British troops were evacuating Boston. On April 4th, during the homeward voyage, Hopkins' ships captured the 6-gun British schooner Hawke and the 8-gun brig Bolton. Shortly after midnight on April 6th, Hopkins encountered the 20-gun Glasgow, and she put up such a ferocious fight that she was able to escape from her substantially more powerful American opponents. At the outset of the fray, fire from her cannon cut Alfred's tiller ropes, leaving Hopkins' flagship unable to maneuver or pursue effectively. The American ships did not attempt to chase their enemy, but after dawn, Glasgow disappeared and safely reached Newport, Rhode Island. Alfred and her consorts came into port in New London, Connecticut on April 8th, and the Americans were at first welcomed as heroes. Still, many officers were miffed with Hopkins, and he was later relieved of command. Alfred was ready to enter the next phase of her career, and our members are here for every era. Thank you so much to our amazing YouTube members and patrons. If you'd like to have some awesome perks like episodes a full day in advance, join our YouTube memberships today. Okay, let's look at the rest of her career. Alfred was inactive through the summer for a number of reasons, but high up on the list of her problems were a shortage of funds and men. On August 7th, Captain John Paul Jones, who had helped to fit her out as a warship and had been her first lieutenant on the cruise to New Providence, was now in command of the ship. He left Providence, Rhode Island on October 26, 1776, in company with Hamden, but she struck a sunken rock before they could get out of Narragansett Bay and returned to Newport. Her officers and men moved to the sloop Providence, accompanying Alfred to waters off Cape Breton Island, which they reached around mid-November. There they took 3 prizes: the brigantine Active on the 11th, the armed transport Mellish on the 12th, and the scow Kitty on the 16th. Due to severe leaks, Providence sailed for home soon thereafter, and Alfred continued her cruise alone. On November 22nd, boats from Alfred raided Canso, Nova Scotia, and here their crews burned a transport bound for Canada with provisions, as well as a warehouse full of whale oil, and they captured a small schooner to replace Providence. 2 days later, Alfred captured 3 colliers off Louisbourg, which were heading from Nova Scotia to New York with coal for the British Army. On November 26th, Alfred and her men captured the 10-gun Letter of Marque John of Liverpool. On the homeward voyage, Alfred was chased by HMS Milford, but escaped after a 4-hour chase. She arrived safely at Boston on December 15th, beginning a major refit. In May of 1777, Captain Alicia Hinman became Alfred's commanding officer. She did not get underway until August 22nd, when she headed for France with USS Raleigh to obtain military supplies. En route, they captured 4 more small prizes, including the brig Sally on September 28th. They reached L'Orient on October 6th, and then on December 29th they sailed for home. They proceeded via the coast of Africa, where they took a small sloop, and then headed for the West Indies, hoping to add to their score of ships before turning northward for home. On March 9, 1778, they encountered the British warships HMS Ariadne and HMS Ceres near Barbados. When the American ships attempted to flee, Alfred fell behind her faster consort. Her allies got further and further away as the enemy drew nearer and nearer, and shortly after noon that day, the British men of war caught up with Alfred and forced her to surrender after half an hour's battle. After her unfortunate capture, she'd be taken to Barbados, where she was condemned and sold. The Royal Navy purchased her and took her into service as HMS Alfred, a sloop of 20 guns. The Admiralty sold her in 1782. According to Lloyd's Register for 1789, there was a ship called Alfred of 400 tons and built in Philadelphia with the master Dyalla and owner named T. Seal. Her trade is listed as London to Jamaica. Unfortunately, there's no readily available interim or later issues of Lloyd's Register, so her history as a merchant ship is unclear. After this, we don't know what became of her. Presumably, she was scrapped, but she might have sunk. We might never know for certain what became of this prize-taking, Revolutionary War-fighting badass of a ship. The minesweeper sat at port in the Solomon Islands, refueling. The water was clear and bright, and it seemed like a normal day in a war zone. Relaxation when possible, but always on guard. The men on board the ship heard a spine-chilling and familiar sound too late: the whirring of propellers and the roar of plane engines. HMNZS Moa was a sitting duck in Tulagi Harbor when the Japanese attacked, and on the next episode of Shipwreck Sunday, we'll take a deep dive into her fate.